Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Drew Cain had long been regarded as one of the most influential figures in Port Charles, but the weight of that influence was slowly being eroded by his own arrogance. Once a man respected and supported, he had gradually allowed his hunger for control to overshadow every personal connection he had left. Where he once seemed like a leader, he now appeared as a tyrant who believed himself untouchable, convinced that no one in the city could outmaneuver him. Yet beneath this dangerous self-assurance was the harsh reality that his downfall might not come from powerful enemies outside his circle, but from those who had once stood closest to him. As Drew stretched his power further across Port Charles, he sowed animosity in every corner. His decisions were ruthless, calculated not with compassion but with a cold determination to eliminate opposition, no matter the human cost. Those who once trusted him now whispered of betrayal, their faith replaced by fear. He had become the perfect target for vengeance, a man surrounded by enemies both overt and hidden. The clearest betrayal came from Martin Gray, who had once been a trusted confidant but had now openly broken away, aligning himself as an opponent. This left Drew with only one apparent ally, Kai Taylor. But Kai's loyalty was not as unshakable as Drew imagined, for beneath his silence grew doubts that threatened to unravel everything. Kai had believed that revealing Curtis Ashford's secret plans to Drew was the right choice, an act of loyalty to ensure Drew's success. But instead of cementing his place as a reliable ally, it had left devastation in its wake. His revelation had shattered Trina Robinson's trust and caused a deep wound within her family. Kai carried the weight of that guilt heavily, and it only grew when he discovered that Drew had launched a vindictive investigation into Stella Henry. Stella, a woman of dignity and compassion, had quietly bent rules to protect struggling patients who had nowhere else to turn. Kai admired her resilience, respected her humanity, and had even built a bond of genuine trust with her. For Drew to target her out of nothing more than a hunger for control revealed a chilling truth. Drew was no noble leader but a cold manipulator who would sacrifice anyone, ally or not, if it served his ambitions. It was in this atmosphere of mistrust and rising tension that Trina stumbled upon evidence of Drew's darker dealings. Whether through an overlooked document, a stray message, or whispers from those too afraid to speak openly, she pieced together fragments of truth that painted Drew as a man cloaked in deception. Armed with this knowledge, she sought out Kai. She recognized in him a man torn between his misplaced loyalty and his conscience, a man who still had the chance to choose redemption. For Kai, her discovery presented the defining choice of his life, to remain tethered to Drew's orbit, blind to the devastation around him, or to break free and use his position to dismantle the very man he once protected. Trina appealed to Kai's sense of morality, reminding him that loyalty meant nothing if it came at the expense of those who truly mattered. She pressed upon him that his silence made him complicit, that his chance to protect Stella and repair what was broken with her family depended on standing against Drew. Though Kai wrestled with fear and doubt, he could not ignore the way Drew's mask had slipped, exposing a man willing to exploit, destroy, and discard without hesitation. It was a revelation that carved deep into Kai's conscience, forcing him to confront the possibility that the only way forward was betrayal. For the first time, Kai saw clearly that Drew's empire was built on intimidation, manipulation, and a veneer of charm that hid rot beneath. Trina's belief in him became the spark he needed to act, a reminder that it was not too late to correct his mistakes. In siding with her, he would not only protect Stella but also reclaim his own integrity. It was a dangerous path, but also one that promised liberation, from Drew's grip, from the guilt that haunted him, and from the illusion that power justified everything. This shift marked a pivotal moment in the growing storm that surrounded Drew Cain. He thought himself invincible, blind to the cracks forming beneath him, unaware that the one ally he still trusted was preparing to use proximity as a weapon. For Drew, the betrayal brewing in silence was not a distant possibility but an imminent reality, and it would strike with a force more devastating than any outside attack. Drew Cain carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed he had every angle covered. In his mind, Port Charles was a chessboard and he was the master player, orchestrating each move with precision and foresight. To him, Kai Taylor was still a loyal knight on that board, dependable and unquestioning. Drew even believed that his carefully crafted gestures of kindness, false acts of generosity designed to maintain control, were enough to keep Kai in line. Yet, this blind reliance on illusion bred complacency. Drew was so certain of his dominance that he failed to notice the shifting loyalty of the one person he thought he could rely on. Kai, positioned close to Drew, had access to everything: confidential documents, private correspondences, hidden agreements, and records that could unravel Drew's carefully woven image. These files were more than paper, they were a map of Drew's corruption, filled with the kind of damning evidence that could destroy his reputation and his career beyond repair. For months, Drew had underestimated Kai, treating him as nothing more than a subordinate willing to execute orders without question. But proximity was power, and Kai was beginning to recognize that what he held in his hands could topple the man who believed himself untouchable. The danger of this potential betrayal was magnified by the growing hatred surrounding Drew. Nearly everyone in Port Charles had been wronged by him in some way, and with each calculated betrayal, he created more enemies eager to see his downfall. If Kai were to align with Trina Robinson, they could set into motion a chain of events that would drag Drew into the abyss of his own making. What made this possibility even more terrifying was the shadow of violence that hung over every miscalculation. With so many people harboring motives against him, a single spark could ignite into murder. Drew's world was closing in, and each misstep tightened the noose he refused to acknowledge. The whispers of conspiracy spread quickly. Some speculated that Drew's demise wouldn't come through political ruin or public disgrace, but rather something darker, a sudden end, a crime born out of revenge. With so many suspects, from betrayed allies to grieving families, no one could be ruled out. In such an environment, Drew's arrogance was more than just a flaw, it was an invitation. His refusal to believe betrayal could touch him blinded him to the truth. Nearly everyone had a reason to see him gone. And Kai, once his most trusted ally, was now the one holding the dagger that could strike deepest. Recent revelations hinted at a significant shift in Kai's perspective. No longer content to stand in Drew's shadow, Kai began to wrestle with the morality of his choices. Trina's influence played no small part in this change. Her quiet persistence, her ability to appeal to Kai's conscience, had unearthed the guilt he carried. She reminded him of the destruction Drew left in his wake and made him see that continuing to protect Drew meant complicity in every cruel act. Where Drew saw Kai as an obedient follower, Trina saw the possibility of a man who could correct his mistakes, a man who could reclaim his integrity by standing against tyranny. This inner conflict set the stage for a dramatic reckoning. Drew believed he was ahead of every threat, but in reality, the walls were closing in. His empire, built on fear and manipulation, had cracks running through its foundation, and Kai's wavering loyalty threatened to shatter it entirely. The question lingered in the air like a blade waiting to fall: would Kai remain bound by misplaced loyalty until the bitter end, or would he take Trina's hand and conspire to deliver the final, fatal blow? The answer would determine not only Drew's fate but the future of Port Charles itself. For in this city, where trust was fragile and betrayal inevitable, every secret was a weapon, every alliance a gamble, and every shadow a reminder that power never came without a cost. Drew had built his world on the belief that he could outwit them all, but the irony was inescapable: the trap being set for him was not designed by powerful enemies he feared, but by the very people he had dismissed as incapable of true defiance. Everything began to unravel the moment Trina stumbled upon the hidden files that exposed Drew Cain's most dangerous secret. These documents revealed his knowledge of a covert medical fund, established quietly by Stella Henry, designed to provide financial aid for underprivileged patients who could not afford life-saving treatments. Instead of recognizing it as an act of compassion, Drew saw it as leverage. His plan was to expose the fund publicly, not to protect justice or enforce the law, but to wield it as a political weapon. For him, Stella's quiet act of mercy was nothing more than another opportunity to cement power, and he had every intention of exploiting it. To Trina Robinson, the implications were chilling. If Drew followed through with his scheme, Stella would not only lose her career but might also face criminal charges. Worse still, countless vulnerable patients would be left abandoned, cut off from the only lifeline they had. The idea that Drew was willing to sacrifice lives for political gain ignited a furious resolve in Trina. She could no longer remain on the sidelines. This was no longer just about politics, it was about morality, about preserving the dignity of people who had nowhere else to turn. Trina sought out Kai Taylor, believing him to be the one person positioned closely enough to Drew to make a difference. She painted for him a stark and undeniable picture of Drew's cruelty and selfishness, laying bare the reality that every act of supposed leadership was merely another mask for manipulation. At first, Kai resisted. He argued that betrayal was not an option, that he could not turn against the man he worked for without destroying himself in the process. But Trina's words lingered, replaying in his mind each time he saw Stella's weary eyes and the quiet strength she carried. The disappointment etched across Trina's face became a wound of its own, one that deepened his guilt. That guilt began to transform into resolve. What started as hesitation soon became a fire burning quietly within Kai. He realized that his loyalty to Drew had cost him far more than he wanted to admit. By enabling Drew, he had betrayed not only Trina but also his own sense of right and wrong. And so, Kai and Trina set into motion a plan that would require precision, secrecy, and no small amount of courage. Their strategy was simple in design but perilous in execution. Outwardly, they maintained appearances. Kai continued to serve Drew with the same diligence as before, answering calls, attending meetings, and carrying out orders to ensure Drew suspected nothing. Trina, too, acted carefully, making sure her sudden involvement appeared no more suspicious than her natural concern for Stella. But beneath that surface calm, they were building a trap layer by layer, tightening a net that Drew would never see until it was too late. Kai's access to Drew's inner workings became their greatest weapon. Working in silence, he infiltrated Drew's internal systems, pulling fragments of data from encrypted files and confidential communications. Each discovery revealed more corruption than the last. Evidence of collusion with high-ranking officials surfaced, along with proof that Drew had not only covered up medical fraud but also diverted funds from public projects into accounts linked to shell companies. These were not just minor transgressions, they were career-ending, life-destroying revelations that could bring Drew's entire empire to the ground. Yet the danger of their mission weighed heavily on them both. Trina was especially aware that if Drew caught wind of their betrayal, he would not hesitate to silence them. He had already proven his ruthlessness in the past, and she knew he would escalate to violence if necessary. For this reason, she insisted that their confrontation with Drew not be left to chance. Instead, they would lure him into a carefully staged meeting, one where the balance of power could finally shift away from him. The trap was crafted with meticulous care. Trina leaked just enough to Drew to make him believe she had stumbled upon critical evidence, framing it as a threat that could be bargained away. She let word slip that she was willing to negotiate, to keep things quiet in exchange for certain concessions. Drew, ever confident in his ability to manipulate others, seized on the opportunity. He saw it as a chance to reassert control, convinced that Kai would help him crush whatever threat Trina posed. But Drew was walking directly into their snare. What he did not know was that Kai had been documenting their private conversations for weeks. Hours of recordings captured Drew's voice as he detailed his corruption, his manipulations, and his willingness to sacrifice allies without hesitation. Each damning admission was stored and preserved, ready to be unleashed at the perfect moment. Where Drew believed himself in control, Kai and Trina were already tightening the noose. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide more than Drew's future. It was about exposing the rot beneath the polished surface of power, about showing Port Charles that even the most untouchable figures could fall. For Drew Cain, the meeting he thought would be a negotiation would instead be the beginning of his unraveling, a reckoning born from the very arrogance that had convinced him he could never be defeated. The room that Drew Cain entered had been staged with precision, every detail calculated to unsettle him without his knowledge. The dim lighting was intentional, the silence oppressive, and the chairs arranged in such a way that his back would naturally fall against the wall. He walked in with his trademark swagger, the same measured confidence that had carried him through countless manipulations in Port Charles. His smirk lingered as his eyes landed on Trina Robinson, seated calmly with a folder at her side. He believed this meeting to be nothing more than another routine cleanup, another opportunity to silence a minor threat before it could snowball. Drew's voice carried arrogance as he began to assert control, laying down the familiar rhythm of intimidation, but Trina's composure did not falter. That unnerved him more than he expected. Then, in a moment carefully choreographed to strike at his blind spot, Kai Taylor emerged from the shadows. For weeks, Drew had taken Kai's loyalty for granted, treating him as nothing more than a reliable pawn. Seeing him now standing beside Trina, his posture rigid, his expression unyielding, shattered that assumption in an instant. What Drew interpreted as allegiance had been a mask, and the betrayal stung not only because it was unexpected, but because it came from the one person he had most trusted. Then the evidence appeared. First came the files. Neatly organized documents outlining Drew's backroom deals, forged signatures, and fraudulent diversions of funds from public projects into offshore accounts. Each page represented a thread pulled from the carefully woven fabric of his empire. Next came the recordings, Kai's quiet, damning archive of conversations, where Drew's voice exposed his own corruption. In those recordings, he boasted of controlling outcomes, of bending allies to his will, of discarding people when they became inconvenient. And then came the photographs. Grainy but unmistakable images of Drew meeting with shady figures in discreet corners of Port Charles and beyond, each picture adding another layer to the damning portrait. For the first time, Drew's confidence wavered. His mouth tightened, his gaze flickered, and his hands curled into fists. He realized he was no longer dictating the narrative. His opponents had taken control, and the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Yet even in the face of overwhelming evidence, Drew's instinct was to fight. He lunged for the documents, his movements sharp and desperate. Papers scattered across the floor as he struggled with Kai, his voice rising into a furious snarl. He shouted threats, vowing destruction, his words dripping with venom as he promised that neither Kai nor Trina would survive this betrayal. The struggle escalated into violence. Chairs toppled, the sound of fists against walls echoed, and Trina clutched the remaining evidence tightly to her chest as she scrambled away from Drew's reach. His fury made him stronger, more dangerous, but also more reckless. Each wild swing revealed not a man in control, but one teetering on the edge of collapse. His composure, the polished mask that had carried him so far, had cracked beyond repair. Now he was a cornered animal, vicious and unpredictable. At the height of the chaos, the door burst open. Martin Gray entered, his eyes cold and focused, and behind him came others, witnesses carefully recruited by Trina and Kai. They flooded into the room, their presence transforming it into a stage of public reckoning. Drew froze, his chest heaving, his face flushed with rage. He looked around, searching for an escape route, but every path was blocked. The walls of the trap had closed in completely. The man who once manipulated an entire city now stood alone, cornered, with nowhere to run. The sight was shocking. Drew Cain, who had once walked the streets of Port Charles as though he owned them, now stood pressed against the wall, his arrogance stripped away, replaced by raw fear and desperation. His reputation, his carefully cultivated image, was unraveling in real time. Yet even then, his mind churned. He calculated, he searched for an angle, some final desperate gambit that could reverse the tide. The fury in his eyes betrayed his intent, he would not go quietly. If he had to fall, he would drag others with him into the abyss. News of the confrontation did not remain contained within those four walls. Like wildfire, word of the betrayal and the evidence spread across Port Charles. Whispers became shouts, rumors became headlines, and Drew's empire of intimidation collapsed under the weight of public disgust. Allies distanced themselves, political contacts withdrew, and the very citizens he claimed to protect began to call for his destruction. His name, once synonymous with power, was now cursed in every corner of the city. But the danger was not over. Drew's desperation was a weapon in itself. He still had loyalists hidden in the shadows, individuals who might act violently on his behalf, and there was still the question of whether he himself would resort to a final act of bloodshed. His threats to Kai and Trina hung heavy in the air, lingering as a warning that he was far from finished. With so many in Port Charles carrying motives against him, the possibility of a murder loomed larger than ever. And the chilling question remained, would Drew be the victim, undone by his enemies, or would he become the perpetrator of a last, reckless act of violence that would plunge the city into chaos? For the people of Port Charles, the downfall of Drew Cain was more than the fall of one man, it was the spark of a wider reckoning.